Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, two rising giants. We put China and India in the spotlight. First, China hurtling ahead in economic growth, dogged by fractious international relationships. But how does it deal with its next-door neighbour? That, of course, is India, gearing up to compete in Asia and the rest of the world. Can it challenge China, particularly with the US on its side? And then the counter-punch, with India looking like a possible regional rival to China. Beijing strengthens its relations with Pakistan. So they're divided by language, political systems and a 3,500-kilometre disputed border. But together they are, effectively, another superpower. If only they could work together. This week on Counting the Cost, we're talking China and India, the two most populous nations on Earth, two fast-moving Asian economies, both in a race to secure the resources to fuel their growth. Let's start with the check of the numbers for you. The International Monetary Fund predicts growth of 9.6% in China and 8.4% in India in 2011, which there, quite frankly, tells the bulk of the story. Two-way trade this year will rise to $60 billion. That's up from $18.7 billion 5 years ago. In fact, China is India's largest trading partner. But the balance of power is heavily lopsided in China's favour. That's reflected in India's trade deficit with China, which was just $1 billion back in 2001, 2002. But by 2007, 2008, it was up at $16 billion. That two-way trade number, though, $60 billion, let's bring that back because it does need a bit of perspective. In 2009, two-way trade between China and the United States was $366 billion. And trade between India and the US, just $38 billion. So India clearly has plenty of catching up to do. And a final point on a wider level, when President Obama arrived in New Delhi, he walked away with $10 billion worth of deals a few months ago. China's Wen Jiabao will beat that with $16 billion and arguably with a cooler relationship. Now, what's the apex of all this? Well, a visit by the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao to India, which looked like good business sense on the outside, probably is as well. They plan to boost trade to $100 billion by 2015. But make no mistake, this is no cosy relationship. These are two big countries with big plans for their own places in the global economy. Coming up, we've got analysis with Brahma Chellaney from the New Delhi Centre on Policy Research. A report from Prerna Suri in India on Premier Wen's visit. But we start with this from Melissa Chan on why China really needs to keep its eye on India.
This is what China prides itself on. Anything you want made will get done cheaply and quickly and delivered to your store shelves. The giant workforce and the discipline and management of Chinese factories make the country an attractive place to do business. And this is its neighbor and rival, India, with an even larger population of working-age people and 20 times the number of English speakers than China. Some people project that India, in the long run, will become the bigger player in the global economy. So China and India are rivals, but they can also be partners. And Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, who visited Delhi 2 years ago, is back again to push that partnership.
If I fly from China to India, the aircraft are full of Chinese businessmen, and if I fly from India to China, they're full of Indian businessmen. So I see it, and there are huge opportunities for both countries to invest in each other, and I see that is taking place.
Take this factory in China as an example. It's owned by an Indian company. The wind turbine maker has production facilities here because China excels at large-scale projects and is a leader in new energy development.
There is undercapacity in India, where there is perhaps overcapacity in China. So we have a situation, for example, whereby a company in India wanting to expand and develop its markets in India, it may take it 2 to 3 years to build the factory to get that additional product into the Indian market, whereas in China they can do that in 6 months.
The Chinese have made clear they'd like this trip to be about increasing bilateral trade. Of course, the two countries have a difficult political relationship, but the hope is the world's largest democracy and a one-party state can at least agree when it comes to business.
A reunion of old rivals. Now, meeting as new partners. India and China holding hands after what's been a tough diplomatic year for both. And $16 billion is what's bringing them together. 50 business deals have been signed during Premier Wen Jiabao's first visit to the country in 5 years, and an agreement to double trade by 2015.
A strong partnership between India and China will contribute to long-term peace, stability, prosperity, and development in Asia and the world.
But two of the world's fastest growing major economies are also in competition for natural resources and global influence. China's visit comes at a time when world leaders have been knocking on India's doors, and some say this visit was in response to that attention. But it's also what they didn't say that got people talking. The two countries have fought over land in the last few decades. No mention was made of these crucial disputes.
The China-India boundary question is a historic legacy. It will not be easy to completely resolve this question. It requires patience and will take a fairly long period of time. Only with sincerity, mutual trust and perseverance can we eventually find a fair, reasonable and a mutually acceptable solution.
No talk either of Tibet. India is home to millions of Tibetans, and the presence of their spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, in this country has irked China in the past. Inside the building behind me, the leaders of both India and China came together to discuss their future strategy. But the real question is whether this visit has given both sides enough confidence to turn their decades-long strategic rivalry into a more cautious partnership. But it's business that's now bringing them together. China is India's largest trading partner, with trade topping over $60 billion this year. And it's this profitable relationship that both sides want to expand. Sensing a big payday, Shen and his friend have come to India from Shanxi province. They offer Chinese expertise to Indian power companies, and that brings in millions for their company.
The first, the business here is big. And the second thing is we are very glad to bring two countries together.
The coming together of these two very ambitious giants, despite their problems and conflicts, that's the real challenge of this visit.
All right, so let's talk about this now with Brahma Chellaney. He is a professor of strategic studies at the Centre for Policy Research in New Delhi. Brahma, thank you for your time. There are all sorts of historic reasons why India and China wouldn't get along. Economically, though, they could do incredible things. These days, there's officially only one superpower, so together, India and China could almost be the other one.
Yes, sure. If India and China join hands, given the fact that they represent 2/5 of the world's population, economically, these two countries are coming back from a relatively short period of decline in history. India and China, in fact, were the largest economies until 1820. And today they are seeking to regain the historical preeminence. So if they do join hands, they will make an impact not just in Asia, but across the world. But these are two very different societies and systems, politically, socially, even economically. Their interests converge in very small areas, for example, in the climate change negotiations, but they diverge in a host of areas. So it's very difficult to conceive of a situation where China and India actually will be joining hands. In fact, the history of the war that was fought in 1962, it resulted from China's invasion of India. That war still weighs down the relationship between these two giants.
Okay, so the two in the end will end up being rivals. That's what you seem to be saying. Can they, though, effectively compete against each other? I think China, it's broadly seen as the more aggressive of the two economies at the moment, certainly growing at a faster rate for a longer time. Do you think India, though, can claw back some of the advantage that China appears to have?
China is 3 times the size of India in terms of its land area, and also it's 3 times larger than India economically. And in fact, it's growing at a more rapid pace than India. So given this kind of fundamental asymmetry, China will always be stronger, the more powerful of the two. Yet the fact remains that China lacks the military power to enforce its writ against India or to enforce its writ against any other rival in Asia. So there are these harsh realities that China has to face, that even though it's the biggest, the most powerful economy, also the largest state territorially, it is not in a position to dominate Asia. It'll have to cooperate with its regional peers. It'll have to frame a more cooperative Asia. But the problem is that China wants to be the number one in Asia so that it can be the peer rival of the United States. But in the process, as we have seen this year, it has picked up territorial fights with a host of neighbors, not just with India, also with Japan, with Vietnam, with several other countries. And 2010 will be remembered as the year when the Chinese tiger roared. This was the year of the tiger in Chinese astrology, and China actually did roar this year.
Okay, then final thought from you then, Brahma, about maybe the wider implications on Asia, because we've talked about global impact. I wonder if the competition, and it is intense competition between China and India, is actually a good thing for the continent, for Asia, or could it end up being maybe a destructive influence?
The China-India relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, merely because of the fact that these are two huge giants. These are continental-sized countries, and if they have a conflictual relationship, it will create a destabilized Asia. It'll create an Asia that is conflict-prone, an Asia where big power competition actually creates even regional and sub-regional instability. Therefore, Asia's future very much depends on how the India-China equation plays out in the years to come. Competition between these two countries is inevitable. But as long as that competition remains healthy, that's fine. But if it becomes ugly, that spells trouble for Asia as a whole.
Brahma Chellaney joining us there from New Delhi. Thank you for your time. Stick around here on Counting the Cost. More of our special look at India and China coming up, plus one more player, actually Pakistan. From building ports to training and supplying the Pakistani army, this China-Pakistan alliance is one to unnerve India. We'll look at it in just a moment. Back to Counting the Cost, your weekly business stop, right here on Al Jazeera. Continuing our look at China and India this week, but introducing Pakistan into the picture now. See, with Washington and New Delhi in a cozy mood, shall we say, Beijing needs another regional ally, and that might just be Pakistan, somewhere India would pretty much never turn to. The two have actually been building some strong ties since the late 1950s. In 1963, they signed their first trade agreement, and since then, China's helped Pakistan build nuclear plants, highway projects. It's heavily involved in the mining industry too. Here are some of the numbers for you. Go back to 2009, two-way trade was worth $6.8 billion. Again, just like India though, it's heavily in favour of China. Among some of the big projects though, an investment of $1.6 billion from China in developing the Pakistani port of Gwadar. And dwarfing that, China's spending $13 billion on an oil refinery quite close to that port. So guess where Premier Wen Jiabao went after his trip to India? Zainab Khora has more now from Islamabad.
From Pakistan, China has access to the Gulf states in Africa, commercially and, if need be, militarily. Clearly a concern for Washington. Gwadar Port in Baluchistan province, just one of Beijing's many large-scale infrastructure projects here. It's an ever-growing relationship that has been a thorn for those seeking to expand influence in the region.
The more the Americans talk about India being built up as a counterweight to China, greater would be their interest in the countries on India's periphery.
The interest goes back decades. China has long been a major arms supplier to Pakistan, even when the country was facing sanctions in the 1990s. It's not only military cooperation. Beijing's supplies of civilian nuclear technology and assistance has concerned both the U.S. and India. What bothers Pakistan? The growing alliance between the United States and India. Analysts here say that will push Islamabad to forge even closer relations with Beijing. It's an alliance that helped them counter its longtime rival India. And Pakistan has benefited from China's political power. This group, Jamaat al-Dawa, should have been on the UN terror list before the Mumbai attacks in 2008. But a recent WikiLeaks website release of U.S. diplomatic messages alleges that China blocked the move at Pakistan's request.
Pakistan depends very much on China and considers it as a friend which will stand on, in times when it needs it.
China was among the first countries to assist after Pakistan's devastating floods earlier this year. A real marriage is how many Pakistanis describe the alliance with Beijing, one that is expected to strengthen at Washington's expense.
So what is the overriding thing we've seen so far in this program? It's that clearly the big business is in Asia, but more than anything else, it's the Asian countries themselves who realize that and are trying to capitalize on it. What, though, of the outsiders, international countries? Have they just perhaps missed the boat? Let's bring in Ian Bremmer now. He's in New York to discuss that and much more. Ian is the president of the Eurasia Group. Ian, we're looking at all sorts of Asian economic relationships on this program today. I would like to get your views on how the US fits in, given that is where you are, and given it's been bogged down with both domestic issues and two wars. Has it missed an opportunity in Asia?
Well, there's no question that overwhelmingly the Obama administration and, of course, Congress are focused on domestic U.S. concerns. They're focused on the deficit, they're focused on tax, they're focused on the economy, they're focused on unemployment. And so as a consequence, while Obama is the classic A student, he wants to show that he knows everything, he can answer every question, he'll travel all over the world, he provides a lot of exposure for the media, but still clearly the international environment is getting comparatively short shrift. And that is, of course, first and foremost in terms of the rising economies of Asia, because to the extent that Obama is doing foreign policy, he has to deal with having American soldiers abroad in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Yeah, but has he made enough of an effort now? There was the much vaunted trip to India a while ago. Is Barack Obama, is the United States now on the right track in Asia?
I think he is. There's no question that to the extent that the United States is having a difficult relationship with China, both on the economic front in terms of American quantitative easing vis-a-vis Chinese currency, issues of intellectual property, cyber tax, indigenous innovation, North Korea, climate, the list goes on and on. The United States recognizes they don't have a lot of economic leverage vis-a-vis China, and Obama particularly realizes that. Where they do have leverage, of course, is to develop better relations with America's traditional strategic allies. And so where did he go on his last trip? He went to India, he went to Indonesia, he went to South Korea, he went to Japan, he went to the major democratic strategic allies of the United States, and he's working to build those relationships to show those governments that the United States has not forgotten them, that they're still committed to the region. There's no question that he has reached a receptive audience in all of those countries.
But China, is there a realistic chance of a major economic trip by a US leader to Beijing anytime soon, indeed any time in the life of this administration?
Well, of course, in January, we have Hu Jintao coming to the United States for a summit, and it's going to be a very important meeting. It's one that is going to get a lot of attention. But let's be very clear. The relationship between the United States and China is getting politicized, and while it would be much more fractious if it were Congress driving it as opposed to the Obama administration, the Obama administration is putting more pressure on China. Little things like the Nobel Peace Prize to really big things like North Korea. And it's increasingly clear that the world's two largest economies have systems that are much more in conflict with each other. And we've never been in a world where that's been true. That really defines the evolution of a new world order. And I think that the best we'll be able to do is get through that state meeting relatively intact in terms of the relationship. It may well be a tough couple of days.
Looking forward, Ian, do you think at some point we're going to be starting to talk about another superpower, one from Asia? I mentioned this earlier in the program, the US, it's obviously the sole superpower now. China and India, though, are both very fast-growing economies. They're both on a good run. Do you think we'd ever use that word to describe them?
Of course, they're both not huge economies. The Indian economy is dramatically smaller than the Chinese economy. You're talking about 1.1 billion people in India with a per capita income just over 1,000. In China, you're talking about a per capita income closer to 4,000, 1.3 billion. So even though India is doing very well, and even though the rate of growth of the Indian economy is likely to exceed China over the next few years, the Indian opportunity and the size of the Indian economy is so much dramatically smaller than China, we really shouldn't be talking about them in the same breath. Now, I do think we need to recognize that the size and the spend of American military power, of course, overwhelms that of every other state, including China. But what's interesting is that we think about what it means to be a superpower. The definition is changing from hard power and from the ability to project military force to economic power. And in that regard, while China is not becoming a superpower, China is, of course, increasingly dominating Asia. And Asia is where all of the world's growth is coming from. Asia is where all of the world's multinationals and banks want to invest. And China is the game in town. And so in that regard, even if China is not becoming an economic superpower, everyone is paying very serious attention. And especially because you always look not just at where you are today, but your expectations, China's a little bit overbought at this point.
So while we're on this topic of Asia, more to the point, as you say, who's dominating Asia, I want to ask you a question which I asked Brahma Chellaney earlier on this program, and that was about the relationship between India and China. We've seen Premier Wen go to India. They are competing economies. There is no two ways about that. Is their relationship, as it is at the moment, good for Asia, or could it potentially be destructive for the continent?
Well, it's both. Competition between India and China, of course, creates some hedging opportunities for other countries in the region who don't want to become completely subsumed by Chinese investment. Harder for countries that have much tighter trade relationships with China, like China, Vietnam. Easier for a country like Indonesia, 300 million in that economy, and they don't want to just go the Chinese model route. But the competition that we see right now between India and China is still very much nascent. There's a lot of Indian investment in China. There's still big trade that occurs between the two countries. But over time, as India's economy starts to grow and gets closer to China's, they're going to become much more resource intensive. They're building out their infrastructure. They're going to start competing in the region for inputs, for iron, and for copper, and for oil. And as that occurs, you're going to see the Indians on the losing end in a lot of investments around the region, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's Africa, whether it's Indonesia, Central Asia, Mongolia. And that's going to really fuel conflict between the two countries. The Indians right now bring more anti-dumping cases against China, the WTO, than any other country out there in the world. That trend is only growing. So the competition between those two countries is really going to become much more dominant over the years.
Yep, it is a fascinating relationship, and it's been great talking to you about it. That is Ian Bremmer joining us from New York. Thanks for your time.
Kamal, a pleasure to be with you today.
So it has been a busy old show this week, and we'd love to get your feedback on it. The easiest way, hop on Twitter, track us down that way. We're adding new followers all the time. You can keep up to date with the show. Send us your thoughts if you like. At AJ Counting Cost is the name to look for on Twitter. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.